Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today's episode recaps an epic week spent in South East Queensland hunting roaring red stags. Today I'm joined by James after returning from this memorable hunt. With the month of April arguably being, the best for hunting here in Australia, we enjoyed prime time in the Australian bush at two different hunting camps. In this first installment of Red Deer Camp, part 1, we discuss a successful red stag story, hind calling stags from long distances, the perfect ambush scenario, lessons learned, as well as a few of the general highlights and just general atmosphere and camaraderie from sharing camp with a bunch of other keen hunters. We'll also touch on some FAQs. If you want to send us an FAQ, please do so by emailing us at info@twinelements.com.au or simply send us a DM on our socials such as Instagram. We have Ayden and James Outdoors, James Doumtsis Outdoors, or of course the Twin Elements account. Without further ado, we'll get into the podcast.
We all know that when it comes to great tasting coffee in the outdoors, you look no further than Dog and Gun Coffee. Their preloaded drip filters are renowned for taking cafe-grade coffee into your hunting camp. But your favourite flavours can also be enjoyed at home with their whole bean variety. Use code TWIN10, that is TWIN, 10 the number, to get $10 off your first order. So on this hunt, Ayden and I transitioned up from New South Wales up to South East Queensland, where we were invited by the Venture Hunting crew to come out and hunt a large parcel of land that they had access to, organised by our good friends Tim and Taylor at Venture. And they'd been out there and hunted on this place for the last couple of years and had really good success, plenty of opportunities. And given that it was such a large parcel of land, they sort of extended the invitation to us when we went up to Venture and did our big movie night display. And we jumped on the opportunity because South East Queensland, as you guys know, has some really, really good hunting opportunities. It may not always have the best quality of heads, but it's got plenty of red stags. So Ayden and I obviously wanted to get plenty of film content, jumped at the opportunity, like we said, and did the 6.5 hour drive up to South East Queensland.
Yeah, I think going into this hunt, we sort of had spoken with the crew and they'd been there for a couple of days and said that as soon as they got there from camp, they could hear red stags roaring, which was obviously going to be pretty exciting for us because we'd spent a little bit of time here in New South Wales hunting red stags and hadn't heard so much as a roar. So the immediate, contrasting difference is that, we're going to a situation where it's quantity probably over quality. Where we were hunting here in New South Wales, there's a lot less density of deer, but the genetics are probably better. Whereas where we were going to in Southeast Queensland, we were going to have opportunities every day. It was more trying to just sift through the animals. Like they had been seeing lots of young stags, red stags that are 2x3s, 3x3s, 4x4s being seen. And we weren't too picky going into this trip in terms of points or anything like that. We just wanted to try and obviously target a mature animal and knew that, we'd obviously be running the glass over a lot of animals, getting up high early, hopefully hearing them roar, and then being able to assess, which one's going to be our target animal.
And so as soon as we arrived in camp, it was pretty late, and the first plan was just to get a bit of a lay of the land and discuss with the team what had been going on. So Taylor pulled out his phone and showed us on the Garmin Explore app and just showed us sort of all the property boundaries, but then also like sort of where he'd been hunting and sort of the congregations of rutting activity. Because even though there is lots of deer in this country, there's definitely sort of pockets, and whether that's because that's where the hinds predominantly live because there's better feed or whatnot. But there was definitely, we certainly learned that there was pockets of higher densities where there was more stags and more rutting activities. So he just showed us all the property boundaries, some roads and stuff that we can use to drive to places, but then also get into certain locations. And then we went from there the next morning, got up nice and early. And all of our hunts have been starting at 4 a.m, so about 2 and a bit hours before light. And we cruised out onto the mountain.
Immediately, we sort of were from the car, basically, where we pulled up. We could hear red stags roaring, which was a bit of a spectacle in its own right. Definitely got the adrenaline flowing and the excitement levels quite high with anticipation as to what was to come, I guess. And we sort of checked which way the wind was going, as simple as that, and basically headed off with the wind in our face. We at that point it was dark, so we weren't too sure exactly what we were walking into, but we had stags roaring on either side of sort of where we'd park. So we just assumed that we'd try and get up a little bit higher, get on the same level as these deer, and then as light started to break, we'd hopefully run the glass over them, get eyes on them, and then be able to sort of pick which stag was obviously going to be the better one and more mature for us to target that morning.
And I think to like a bit of a backstory. So I'd hunted South East Queensland a few times personally, and sort of probably knew what to expect in terms of like the old quality and quantity scenario. Whereas I think Ayden like hadn't actually hunted South East Queensland at that stage. So we like as soon as I got out of the car, there was not a giant, but a mature 4x5, I think he was, that we could like see sort of up on the hill. And I said to Ayden, like, oh, he's not too, like, not too bad a stag, knowing that having my expectations maybe a bit lower than what we'd come from like the sort of Hunter Valley area that we were chasing red stags in before. And we end up getting up, when we were up on the hill, we end up locating this stag, and he probably went past about 50 or 60 meters below us. And Ayden thought I was actually talking about a different stag just because, he wasn't probably, I don't know, he wasn't used to maybe a bit smaller heads in Queensland, and also the quality maybe being a little bit less than what you'd sort of expect in the Hunter Valley. Not to say that you can't find absolute giants in Southeast Queensland, but it's just, the diamonds amongst the rough sort of scenario. But yeah, when we were up high, we were able to locate plenty of different stags. To be honest, like the beauty of Southeast Queensland, like what we're saying, is there was, shitloads of stags going off in every direction. So the country's also a fair bit more open, so you're able to sort of run the glass over the hills and, yes, here's a young stag, or here's a bit more mature, and then, we'll go for that one.
Yeah, it was definitely a case of being a little bit inexperienced with reds in that setting. Like I've hunted reds in Victoria years and years ago. Honestly, probably 10 years ago was the last time I personally hunted reds, if not longer. Same actually goes for the fallow deer. Like I've been behind the camera over the last few years, just filming other people's hunts and sort of being part of that. But this year, obviously with the bow in hand, I had set myself a goal of obviously just taking like mature deer or definitely like a personal best or something like that, as it had been such a long time. And to be honest, yeah, when James said, "Oh, there's a really good 5-6 up there," I sort of had a vision in my head of this thing with nice spellers and points and whatnot, and a bit of mass and stuff. Whereas when we actually laid eyes on that first stag at, I think it was a bit closer than 50 or 60. He was probably about 40 when he went below us on this ridge. I sort of just like looked at him and went, oh, okay, cool. Like, yeah, he's a 5x4 or whatever, but his fourth and fifth points on that antler are about half an inch sort of tines. They're barely even something you'd count in that sense. But he did have a little bit of a frame. But to be honest, he walked past that quick. I didn't really get a great look at him. And I think I also was in the moment of, we've got, up to 5 or 6 other stags roaring. I wasn't too fussed. Like I sort of just shrugged it off as, we'll move on to the next one, which was pretty cool being able to do that. But I very quickly had a discussion with James, because I just said, like, was that the stag that you were talking about having seen earlier? And he was like, yeah, that's a good stag. And I was like, okay, well, that really does like set your expectations, I think. And then going in from there, it was evident over the next coming days that we would have seen, 20 to 30 stags. And yeah, he probably was in the top handful of stags it would seen just in terms of age and mass. And that brings us into like the next encounter, I guess, where we ended up going a bit further up the ridge, and the morning was starting to get a little bit away from us. We had to be back at camp to do a few things with the property owners. But we basically got into this situation where we had a young 4x4 on the opposite face, and just wanting to see, the effectiveness of a hind call, we thought we'd set up and basically, let out a hind call and see what his response was.
So we set up, and we sort of probably a little bit rusty in this first calling situation, because we set up and we learnt a hard-earned lesson, and that was we gave a couple of calls out. He roared back to us as they typically do, often saying, come over here, sweetheart, sort of thing. And we probably sat there for 5 to 8 minutes, did a couple of hind calls, he'd roar back, a couple of hind calls, he'd roar back. And then we sort of went to to move on, I guess. And then pretty quickly he gave out another roar, and I reckon within 15 seconds he'd probably gone. He was all of a sudden from just say halfway up his hill down into the bottom of the gully, which then also meant 20 to 30 seconds later he's like right at us. Which doesn't leave you a lot of, especially with the open country, like people don't realize like red deer can vary. If you're on an open hill, like they can easily, and it's a tight gully, like they'll easily spot you across the gully at 200 meters because there's nothing there. So they'll see you walking around, especially if you're hind calling, like they're expecting to see deer there, I guess, too. So that's like a huge consideration because I think a lot of people have had out in South East Queensland and stuff, you're hind calling or calling deer in and they go to move and stuff, even that you're 300 meters away, like that red will pick you up easy as clear as day. Like if you can see them, why can't they see you? And so we were very cautious of that. But because we'd sort of moved out of our ambush situation, we were caught in the open a bit. And so we've sort of set up quite poorly, I guess, and just jumped into a bit of cover. And like the red stag ended up coming past us at 30 meters. Not that it was really one we wanted to shoot, but more just probably educating us and sort of giving us a clip on the ear that we needed to be like, okay, well, actually make sure you give these stags time to come in. Because some come in, as we learnt, like quite quickly where they'll cover hundreds of meters, rapidly at a sprint, but other ones will take a bit more time. And that's where we ended up setting up, like, so whenever we'd actually hind call 2 stags, it sort of became this thing that we'd probably set up for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, which is quite a long time, but we'd find a good spot and then be hind calling normally to a specific stag that we've located, or if there's like 5 or 6 stags going off in a basin or whatever, and just give it time because there's also a lot of younger stags, but sometimes mature stags too that will come in silent. And we've had that this whole rut where, there's been probably as many stags that have come in full roaring, ripping noise. There's been ones that have come in silent and not made a noise. And then all of a sudden you hear a twig break at 30 on your left and you look over and there's a stag coming in. But yeah, this one sort of caught us by surprise and definitely taught us the lesson that we needed to carry out for the rest of the rut.
Yeah, I think one of the most valuable taking points from that was also that we were trying to hide, 2 people, like obviously the hunter or the person with the bow, and then the person filming, usually just a meter or 2 behind them over their right-hand side shoulder to try and catch the shot sequence. So, you might set up an ambush in our circumstance in front of a little bit of lantana and think, yeah, I've got enough break up and concealment. But to a stag that's racing in, pinpointing a noise, and it's amazing how well they can come in from hundreds of meters to be 15 meters below you on the perfect line, looking exactly at the tree that you're standing at, being like, there should be a hind here. So I think that was just a really valuable learning curve on that first young 4x4. And as James said, like he come in past us at 30 meters. I end up going to full draw on him just to practice the motions, settle the pin, let down, all that type of stuff. And then he ended up going around and winding us. But it was just a really good learning curve for me, especially because a lot of the next scenarios and ambush settings was me trying to work out where I wanted to go to then shoot a stag. And you'll hear shortly in a little bit where I think I just took a lot more time in the next few setups to go, okay, I'm covered, I'm feeling good, I can draw my bow back here, I can get a good range on all these different landmarks. There's enough of a view in front of me where the deer's coming through thick bush and then opens up into a slight opening. I can get a shot there without me being too exposed. But my cameraman in this instance, James, who's behind me, is also super covered and has because the thing that I took for granted, I guess, was that, yeah, we're probably concealed enough where this stag's going to come into bow range and not pick us out. But then if I have to draw the bow back and James is sitting there over my right shoulder, he's going to, any movement of me drawing the bow back is going to attract that view towards us. And then if there's 2 people standing there in front of a lantana bush, it's going to be quite obvious. Whereas, if we can start getting some vertical cover in the form of little iron barks or a tree and then a bit of lantana, and James can be a little bit more hidden behind me, I just figured for the next few ambush setups, it was going to really play into our hands, which it eventually did, which was great.
Yeah, I think it was just and when you're at that sub 30 meters, they pick up every little tiny thing. So with that stag, he actually picked me because we'd set up poorly, our vision was really poor and we only had about 30 meters. And so he did this roar below us, but I didn't know if he was coming up on our right, left or center. And so I'm sort of slowly turning my head, left, right and stuff. And then Ayden actually said 12 o'clock, so we normally use clock faces and stuff when we're calling animals in because it just makes it easier to be 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 3, because left for me might not be like my left might be different to Ayden's left sort of thing. So we normally pick a tree that's, okay, that tree's 12 and then we go off that. And so Ayden said, yeah, 12 o'clock. And I'd actually just like, I turned my head, 2 inches, I reckon, like it was nothing. And he was boom, straight onto me. But like what Ayden said, I was also hanging off his right-hand side. So Ayden was in really good cover and I was in pretty, I'd say, bit of no man's land where like, yes, you're broken up by like the lantana bush, but you're getting only like the outskirts of the bush rather than being like that center mass of the bush. So I was almost mildly skyline sort of thing. And yeah, he picked up my movements and then I've like slowly moved down into the camera to try and get some footage just because he wasn't a shooter or whatever. And yeah, even that tiny little movement of dropping my eye line into the like the top of the camera, probably an inch or two, he picked that up too, and he didn't really like it when I was like, he could see I was moving at 30 meters. And I think like even those tiny little, like me just rolling my thumb to focus the camera from when we're using manual focus and stuff, like he picked that up and like, so he knew there was something there. And that's the big thing. Like, so setting up and having plenty of cover is really important, especially when you're calling in stags because they're coming straight into, like they're looking for you essentially. And especially like a ratted up red stag trying to find a hind, like they really, really want to find that hind. And so yeah, any movement, like if you're moving at all, that's including having your bow up or your rifle up or whatever, like have your gun up against a tree if you're calling these stags in, because if you've got it by your side, like you're probably not going to be able to pull it up by the time they turn and run off.
With unmatched quality, performance, and reputation, Aimright International is a family and community-focused business. They're our go-to for spear guns, wetsuits, and fins. Whether it be a simple shore dive, island hopping, days on the reef, or bigger dives in the vast blue, Aimright has you covered underwater. And it sounded a little bit silly, but like we would try and set up where we had like 30 meters of opening to shoot the stag and hopefully get it on film. Whereas realistically, we probably should have like maybe searched a little bit harder because we'd often do it on like a bit of a bench where they were coming up from some steep stuff and then they'd crest the bench, we'd see their antlers. But one of the things that made it really difficult was if they did come in silent, and like this stag in particular called once he ran from, 500 meters away from the opposite face, he was roaring. He went all the way down to the bottom of the gully, roared, and then he kind of came up silent for the next 30 or 40 seconds. And again, he covered the ground like hundreds of meters very quickly. But it wasn't until we saw his antlers at 30 odd meters that I had time to say, yep, 12 o'clock, stag's coming. And James obviously heard that and then had to react. And then he's on us. He's at 30. He's eye level with us. He's viewing us. So that sort of thought obviously then played into our decision making for future setups as well, where we would actually kind of get to the edge of those little lips and be able to hopefully see on maybe a bit more of a steeper angle where, you had to wait a bit more to get the right shot. But it was often going to be sub 20 in a little bit more thicker stuff. But hopefully because we were like directly on top of them looking way further down the valley or the gully, we could sort of see them coming from a lot further and be able to like track and plan it. And then we could just stay silent and obviously if needed, do a hind call. If not, just play it by like their approach and let them come in. Because it was all good and well. Like the stags that roared a ton were great. They were easy to sort of pinpoint and know exactly when they're going to crest the hill or, come into range and things like that. Whereas the stags that were silent would just pop up. And it's amazing how you hear them from, 500 meters away. And then 30 seconds goes by and that same stag is like, within 30 meters popped up on the ridge and you're sort of out to your left and you've been looking to your right going, is he going to come in from there? So it's just, when you do set up for these ambush scenarios, you really are setting in for the long haul. We learned very quickly that, you've got to call and then be patient. Just set up and just basically sit there. There's nothing worse than when moving, when they're coming in or thinking, nah, we've given it 5 minutes and that stag should have come in, but he's roared once to let you know, yep, I've heard the hind calls, and then he's made a dash for 700 meters, which is what we're calling them in from at times, and he's taken, 5 minutes to get down across the gully up to your ridge, and then he's right there at 30 as you start, taking the arrow off the string and putting your backpack back on and moving. So we just found that, if an animal was roaring initially to the hind calls and then goes quiet, it was actually quite a good indication that they were starting to approach, obviously stealthily.
Yeah, I definitely think like sometimes, silence is better. It actually made me nervous sometimes because they'd be roaring, and then they'd stop. And then you're like, okay, I think he's coming. Like, and then, and then all of a sudden they roar. And for me, another big thing was if they roared, and even if they moved from their location. So we had a couple of stags that like couldn't locate it because it was echoing the hind call because we were calling these things in from so far away. Um, they would, if they moved in any direction, we took that as a positive sign. So if they like, because generally they're sitting on a ridge with hinds or without hinds, but they're just roaring off a bench somewhere. So even if they moved 50 meters to their left, right, up, whatever, like some of them moved away and then came back to us. But if they like shuffled their feet in any way, we were like, okay, they've moved, which is probably a good thing. Which was just really interesting because we had like one stag that we actually called in from the neighbour's place. Like he was probably 800 meters onto the neighbour's place, and we were up at the top of the gully, like hind calling down. And this is jumping into another story. He ended up doing this massive like C shape and coming into us, and then he winded us, which was a bit disappointing. But he came in from miles away, and it's just because our echo was going into the valley and he couldn't pinpoint us exactly. But yeah, same scenario. Like he started moving his feet, and eventually he found us.
I think it's worth saying here as well that if you're a red deer hunter and you haven't necessarily shot a stag with the bow, or your expectations are that you want to put your first red deer on the ground, I can't tell you how many instances where we sort of didn't really use, like, I know we've spoken a lot about location roaring in the past, and that's probably more for like lower densities or first thing in the morning if the deer aren't making any noise. But when you walk into a bit of a gunfight and there's 5 or 6 stags roaring on the same ridge, and they're feeding off each other's aggression and tone and whatnot, and one roars and then the other one roars on top of it, and they're roaring and it's just chaos, which is sort of what we walked into, to be honest. And they did so most of the time until around 9 a.m. So from like 5:40 to 9 a.m. we were just inundated with roars, trying to obviously get as much eyes on stags as possible to pinpoint which one we were going to target. But if you're a hunter that is going into your first, second, third, 10th, whatever roar it is, going, I just want to put a deer on the deck and get some meat for my family, then I think you can't really, as we've obviously just discussed for a little bit at length, undervalue a hind call. I would just be hind calling my ass off basically, because it was ridiculous as to how far away deer were coming from. And what I would do is I would sit somewhere, and even if you waited until the thermal switched and you knew that the wind was pumping in your face going uphill and you're above these deer and you've got a good vantage point, and hopefully you're on a sunny face but you're just in a slight bit of shade so you're not getting picked out when you're drawing or you're putting your rifle up or whatever. But if you just sat there and hind called, like we had spikers running in from miles away, we had 2x2s running in, we had 4x4s, and as we'll get to in a second, we had like a nice 6x6 at the end of the trip come into bow range. So we actually ended up calling in yearlings in some instances. Like there were, like, our hind calls were, we did a range of them basically. So James does a more nasally sort of deeper tone hind call, and then I was probably better at doing the higher pitched like yearling, estrus sort of red deer calls. But together we made it sound like there was, 2 or 3 or 4 red hinds sitting on this ridge waiting for a stag to come in. And I think that attraction obviously brought deer in from miles away. So yeah, that's a recommendation if you do just want to get a deer on the deck, which, some hunters on this trip did. As I said, we had awesome camaraderie in camp with the venture crew, and there were some hunters that had come out that had never shot deer before, and just by using a few, seductive hind calls, managed to secure their first stag with the bow. And it was pretty exciting to obviously share that excitement with a young hunter who's taken his first deer. But if you're listening to this podcast going, oh yeah, it's all good and well that you guys are talking about shooting these mature deer, but I just want to get my first on the deck, learning how to hind call and then being confident with doing it and knowing when to do it is going to be one of the best tools and techniques to obviously try and get that stag on the ground.
Yeah, so we'll do, because we're going to get questions about this, and we've done it before, but I'll just do some hind calls and you can do some hind calls now. I might just move back from the mic a little bit, so excuse the squeaking of the chair. But yeah, yeah. The first one was probably more of a hind call. Yeah. And then like the higher pitch, like what I can't really do it, but I can sort of sound like a needy little fawn. But like we've said, it sort of sounds like a crocodile going off. But yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's like my one.
Yeah, and again, my tone's a little bit different. Like I'm probably a bit more high pitch, which some people say is more likely to be a fawn call. Which again, if a stag hears a fawn call, they're probably thinking there's a hind nearby. or maybe like an estrus red hind doing a call. So, and some of them will do really short. So it might just be, others you'll drag out and add a bit of a nasally part to the end where it's, but honestly, when you do this as a bit of a symphony and like an orchestra of calls, it does work. And as long as it sounds somewhat relatable to that, as you can tell, there's a lot of variation in my calls compared to James's calls, but we did them together, we did them separate, and we called stags in 2 different states on multiple different properties. So it's been, really good to just play that out over the raw.
Yeah, and I definitely think, just adding to what Ayden was saying about the trying to get your first animal on the deck, whether it be with the bow or a rifle, like I would just create this like red deer party essentially on a hill by yourself, or if you've got a mate, like put yourselves 100 meters apart and just start roaring your guts out at each other. Like if you and your mate have never shot a red stag with a bow, just 100 meters apart, roar and roar and roar at each other. Like you don't even have to sound good. You're just trying to build on the atmosphere of each other. Chuck some hind calls in there, and you'll be having red deer. Like, because it makes it sound like the action is where you are. You know what I mean? So then you'll have other red deer coming into you. And same thing, if you're just by yourself, I'd be getting on that mountain. You can hind call. You're definitely going to draw stags in with that because that's what it's all about. But roaring as well. Like we had stags coming in when we were. A lot of the time, like Ayden was saying, like the roaring would sort of stop it as the day heated up at about 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. You'd still hear roars and stuff, and especially if you're in the right valley, like they might roar all day. But it was nothing for me to do, like almost have this like red stag party by myself where I'd just start roaring and roaring and roaring and roaring and roaring, and you keep roaring. And then, one would just go, "Arr," and do this like little moan back. And then so you do a moan back, and then you build up from that and build up. And then, and this is going on for like 10 minutes. Within 10 minutes, then they're full noise at 10 o'clock, bloody screaming down the barrel at you, and called in a fair few stags because then I'd switch it up to a hind call. And then had plenty of stags coming in across the ridge to come and check out, these hind and this scenario. But the thing is, when you start building it up, like you start with you just roaring normally, and then all of a sudden you pick up another stag because they've been roaring all morning, so you know that there's stags that can hear you. So that's the funny thing. You're like, why are you bloody not answering me? And then one does a little moan, and then you moan back to him, and then he roars, and you feel it out, and then you build that up. And then normally another stag chimes in from somewhere else, and then all of a sudden at 10:30 in the morning, you're back having 5 stags roaring at you. And it can actually be really helpful, especially in that South East Queensland country, because it is a bit more, open. You can then at 10 o'clock in the morning relocate some stags and be like, yep, no, here's a shit one. Yeah, we've seen him. No. Or here's a good one. We'll go for him while he's bedded. And you know that he's not most likely not going anywhere. But we called plenty of stags in, as we'll get to, in the middle of the day, and had some really good success. But if you just want to get your first stag on the deck, then make that red deer party and do plenty of calls, and something will definitely come in.
Specialising in high-quality supplements and nutrition, from electrolytes and hydration add-ins to their wild bars, Atlas Wild helps to fuel our outdoor adventures. Their Regenerate lineup has been a game changer whilst hunting up north in the heat and humidity. It's perfect for those on the quest for hydration when losing lots of sweat. With grape, lemon lime, blue raspberry and orange flavours, there's something for everyone. Another favourite of mine is their Fusion lineup. It's my go-to for rest and recovery towards the end of a day. It's perfect for a big pack out. Now available in peach iced tea and lemon lime flavours. When shopping on the Atlas Wild website, be sure to use code TWIN10. That's TWIN 10 numerically for 10% off your next order. Speaking of red deer parties and a little bit of success, what we might do is just shift over now. To be honest, the next few days were a bit of a blur, as we've sort of spoken to. The roaring was pretty intense. We had multiple opportunities on young stags, but we really were sifting through, tens of stags each morning, each afternoon. They'd start roaring a little bit later. It was getting dark around 6 p.m. And they'd probably start roaring at about 3:30 at the best, generally a bit later, maybe 4:30. You'd have a couple of hours to try and, pick apart which stag you wanted to go in on. So again, we had no shortage of opportunities. It was truly a magical time of the year to be chasing red stags, and just the plethora of calls was amazing. But we did eventually get to what was going to be like pretty much our final morning on the place. And this particular morning, We had a few close calls. James and I had the previous evening put a stag to bed. I think it was that same 4x5 that we'd basically passed up at 30 to 40 meters below us on the first morning that James had identified as a good stag. We had him and we did this bloody roaring back and forth. And the only trouble, he wouldn't close. He would come into about 30 to 40 meters, but in some pretty thick stuff, and wouldn't just commit to coming in that last little bit because he had a hot hind, or a hind that we think was in estrus, and he didn't want to leave her because there were so many other stags in the vicinity. So we would basically call and then have 2x3s come in, have an encounter with them, and then have to try and pursue this stag again, just totally following him up the mountain. And he took us into this really cool gully where James and I basically said, that night, let's have an early night, get to bed, and then tomorrow morning we'll try and get up in that very same vicinity, because there was just stags going off everywhere. And I think that was probably due to the fact that there was actually something worth roaring for in that hind that was in estrus, and her pheromones and scent obviously were putting them all in a bit of a frenzy. So that brings us to pretty much our last morning, where we headed up the ridge and had stags calling immediately. We actually located a new stag. It was a pretty mature 4x4, and being our final morning of the place, we hadn't actually had too many encounters on mature animals. So he was roaring pretty well above us. The wind was great first thing in the morning. The thermals definitely weren't switching. So we decided to set up for a bit of a hind call, and immediately, took a bit more time because we identified he was a shooter. James and I sort of separated about 3 or 4 meters. We had good visibility in the bottom of this gully, and he had to sort of race down from the top of a ridge through all these eucalypts and ironbarks, pretty steep descent, cross a little minor creek, and then come up to us. And where we positioned, we just hoped that the thermals would keep sucking down the creek. So we sort of got pretty tight in with it. Eventually just started calling, and basically we let out a few little hind calls, and straight away his roaring amplified. His frequency and tone got more exaggerated, he was roaring more often, and he was roaring quite aggressively. We actually noticed he'd walk 5 meters down towards us and then sort of call, walk 5 meters down towards us and call, and that gave us more of a confidence booster basically to just continue with that. So yeah, we did so, and within about 2 to 3 minutes, this stag was racing down the hill. And it's pretty interesting, when they flip that switch and say, yep, I'm committing to go and find that hind, it's you definitely want your arrow on the string, broadheads, ready to go, have ranged everything beforehand, everything set up, backpack off, whatever. So we made sure we did all those processes after that reminder and lesson from day one. We had this stag racing down the hill, and he had no hesitations, running down, crossing the creek. And just as he was coming into about 30 meters, his head went behind this tree. I was starting to take up tension and draw back on the string, and I saw him, basically I was coming to full draw and saw his nose just start twitching, basically felt the breeze on the back of our neck, and the wind had just shifted tiniest little bit. And he had smelt us, but again, I think the wind, once he crossed the creek, sucked back down for us. And he sort of sat there about 30 meters, just looking up the hill, looking down the hill, not sure exactly what was going on, not wanting to move in any direction, but just reading his body language. The hunt was done. He'd smelt us and smelt something that wasn't obviously going to fly with him. And he'd basically very cautiously then sort of trotted up off the hill, let out a roar, oddly enough, and then disappeared further up the ridge. But that was a really cool encounter. And to be honest, it got the blood pumping a little bit, thinking, geez, hopefully there are a few older animals in this little corner. Pretty much with that, there wasn't too much time sitting there going, what could we have done? If that wind had held out, I would have been at full draw, and him coming into less than 20 meters on a perfect line. So it was just a matter of, chasing the next roar and hopefully repeating that scenario.
Yeah, I think with that one, because we had seen so many stags at this point, we'd probably sifted over, it'd be at least 20 to 30 stags in the couple of days. Had that 4x5 that was, he was not bad, but he wasn't the 4x4 that we just had that encounter on was a fair bit more mature. The heart did drop a little bit on that one, especially getting him in so close and then having the wind sort of turn, which was a little bit disappointing. But in typical fashion, just kept going up the gully, kept trying to locate stags, kept calling, and had, we had probably 5 or 6 stags calling in this massive basin. And we let out a couple of hind calls and ended up having another 3x3 come in and give a couple of roars, just a young one that sort of filtered through below us at maybe 20 meters or so. And we just kept going up the valley, just trying to locate stags and get eyes on these stags, because we were sort of on the east facing slope, and so we were in the sun, had the thermals ripping up nicely to us. But a lot of the stags, as it would heat up, would migrate to that sort of western facing slopes, so that they were sort of in the cool shade as the morning progressed, and keep calling from there. So we were sort of trying to glass into these pockets, I guess, between the trees and locate these stags. And some of them, you get eyes on it and it'd be ripping the most deathly guttural roar, and you're like, oh, perfect, it's going to be a big stag. And then it'd be a 2x2 and you're like, oh, shit. And you keep moving. But yeah, I think I better let Ayden tell this story from now.
Yeah, well, I think that input that you just gave of which side of the face we were on. So we were on the eastern sunny face, and we couldn't really hear any roars on our side of the ridge. Whereas as soon as you went down that valley, crossed the little creek, and went up onto the western side of the face, there were, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever, how many stags calling. And James had said, using again of his probably South East Queensland and just bush knowledge, he said, if they're all on that western side of the face, let's get up a little bit higher so the wind's perfect, because it was starting to get a little bit later in the morning, say 9 a.m. And typically the stags were quietening down at this point, whereas this morning they were just going off, like there was no stopping them for the next few hours, really. But James just said to me, like, if they're all calling on that western face, let's actually jump over the ridge. The thermal should still be sucking up, even though it's going to be a bit shaded, and we'll start, listening to stags, because just the topography, we couldn't actually hear too much of what was going on sort of behind us, if you imagine, on our western side of the ridge, on that same ridge that we were on. So we ended up doing a bit of a loop. And as soon as we got to the other side of the ridge, that experience that James had sort of suggested paid off. And basically we heard, I don't know, maybe 3 stags. There was definitely a few less stags, but there was one that was particularly close. And when I say he roared, I would say he probably honestly only roared from like 200 meters away. And James and I went, yep, let's just, again, numbers game. It was in this nasty thick gully. So we just said, let's drop down a little bit, make sure the thermals are still sucking up, but we just want to get to a spot where we'll be able to call this stag, hopefully. Let's just make sure we get in the really good scenario to do so. And we basically let out a few hind calls to try and draw him in out of that thick gully, as we said. And straight away, by the time we'd probably descended about 50 meters off the top of the ridge and still had the thermals right, he'd probably covered another 50 to 100 meters himself. So when he roared and confirmed that, he was interested in those hind calls, he honestly probably wasn't too far away. I'd say maybe 100, 150 at most.
Yeah, if not less. Might have even been 80 to 100 by the time because he was sort of around, like he was in the gully, but he was sort of around the corner a little bit too. And so, he came up through this really gnarly, thick sort of sapling stuff in the bottom and gave out a roar. And we were like, well, he's definitely coming. And like we said, it's like when they go silent, a lot of the times it was like, okay, like my head is on a swivel. It's like, where is this thing coming from? Like, cause it's most of the time it's coming. Like I could actually get nervous most of the time, because it was quite often they were coming, and it was less frequent that, they'd roar, go quiet for 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden they'd roar and they'd be back in the same position. Like often it'd be like they roar and they've cut the distance in half or 3/4 and they're like right there already. And you're like, oh shit, here they come, so it was pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I'm not going to lie, I was a little bit nervous on this hunt, because it kind of felt like, to be honest, as soon as I laid eyes on this stag, and he probably appeared first at around 80 meters. And before that, he'd covered that like 100 or so meters to 80 and was out of sight. But it took him about 2 or 3 minutes where he was just, it seemed like he was taking one step, roaring. And I reckon he would have roared 20 to 30 times over, a couple of minutes. And I'm sitting there going, geez, this wind can't hold out forever. Like the thermals were good, but I think probably from that earlier calling situation on that 4x4, I was just a little bit nervous, and you'll probably hear that from in the video when it comes out. The lav mic was sitting on my chest, and I had to remind myself, just because it was, and that's probably the fortunate thing about this calling situation that I'm going to go into, is because it did take quite a lot of time. I actually had time to sit there and go like, dude, just relax. The chance of you actually shooting this stag are very, very low, and I'm kind of glad that I had that ability to reflect in the moment, or not even reflect, but the foresight to say, yep, he's a nice stag. And as soon as he popped out at 80 meters, you'll hear in the footage, I say to James, like, yeah, he's a shooter. And I could just see that he was a really heavy 6x6. He sort of lacked probably a little bit of length. But for me, like, he was what I'd envisaged going into this trip, as if I could have an opportunity on a stag like that, I'd be absolutely stoked.
And a little funny side note, because like yeah, there was like a few times where like talking back and forth and stuff, like, oh, is he a shooter and stuff? Is he mature enough and blah, blah, blah. And I just remember when he like popped out at 80 meters through all this thick stuff, and like he was still in the thick stuff, so we could sort of only just see him. But I thought Ayden said to me, is he a shooter? And I'm like looking through the viewfinder, like videoing this thing, and I only had a smaller lens on, so he's quite still far away, but I knew he was like really mature and heavy for like South East Queensland. Like, he was probably one of the better heads I've ever seen up there. And I thought he said like, oh, is he a shooter? And I was just, like, I can't remember. It was essentially, I'm like, yes, he's definitely a shooter. And I didn't realize that Ayden had been like, himself being like, yeah, he's definitely a shooter too. And then he like looked at me, he's like, yeah, I know he's a shooter, like. And then yeah, anyway, he just kept his line in coming in.
Yeah, and again, like, typically all of the younger stags that we'd hire and called to, once they made that commitment to come in, it was a matter of like seconds, and it seemed like they were on top of us. Whereas this was the complete opposite. This stag, the way he sort of like slowly meandered into range, was just it was a bit hard to deal with. Like, and you'll hear my heart rate was probably going through the roof. But there were actually a few times where he would sort of come in, and I'd pre-ranged everything. There was this lantana bush that I knew was at 30 meters, and this stag came in from 80, 60, 40, and he's just roaring the whole time, taking a few steps, roaring, really looking for these hind calls. So there was actually got to a stage where I sort of directed a few hind calls further to my sort of right, where I was hoping that he was going to come in slightly on our left, but the way he was walking, and because he was going so slowly, I knew the wind was sort of sucking up that way. I wanted him to actually basically come back and straighten up towards us a little bit more. And I hadn't realized how steep this ridge actually was, because where he was at 60 meters, we could only really see the tops of his head and antlers. And even when he finally got to that lantana bush that I'd ranged at 30, that I thought there was a nice little bench that if he stopped broadside at 30, I'd be able to drill him. He stopped there and roared and roared. And again, I could only see the tops of his head and neck. So it quickly became apparent that, like, I'd chosen a really good spot for concealment, but shooting wise, this was going to be a close quarter sort of combat thing. So again, directed a few hind calls away when he was sort of slowing down, and that just brought him right in and tightened up that line so that he came in pretty much head on towards us, if not slightly to the left, which was perfect. But when he walked up through that very, very steep terrain, I just really thought, again, with two people, I'm going to want to draw slightly early here. So when he was at 20 or so, and walking through my shooting lanes, I couldn't see him. But then as soon as he put his head behind a few bits of trees and things that I'd sort of planned to be behind for James and I drew back and was comfortable just holding, because I didn't want him to get to a spot where I could shoot him, try and draw back, and then him see me and then see James behind me and get caught out. So I think it felt like an eternity. In reality, he was roaring in our face for, I think I held the bow back for about a minute as he cut the distance from, 15 meters to 7. And just as I thought like he was going to present this shot, he was sort of coming in, quartering on, and it was at about 10 meters. I was ready to like shoot. I'd been tracking him with the pin, and he just stopped perfectly behind this giant ironbark tree. And I nearly like let out a laugh, like thinking this is ridiculous. But it was just funny. It was just one of those moments where it was like, this is when the wind's going to swirl, I betcha, like just as he stopped. And anyway, it didn't, it prevailed. And then he takes a few more steps, walks into 7 meters, and just before I end up letting off the release of the arrow, he does this one last guttural roar that I'll sort of remember forever. You could see the back of his tonsils, I think, like his howl, and his eyes sort of rolled back. It was pretty gnarly, and we've got it all on footage, but I just took a lot of time picking out my spot and where I was going to place that arrow. And I did have to shoot over a tiny little bit of brush and stuff, which is why I held for so long. But as soon as I released that arrow, it all felt good. And the arrow basically struck him at the base of the neck, the penetration immediately was really, really good. I saw the white Fletcher's berry right up to the base of his neck. And it was funny, the way the arrow hit him, it almost like propelled him and flung him backwards where he like spun down the hill. It was almost like the force of the arrow hit his neck and then turned his head for him to run downhill.
Camp Chef is all about portable cookware, without any compromise to power or efficiency. Their range of cooking options include pellet grills, a cast iron range, and portable cooking systems. For better food in the bush or at home, head to their website to check out the complete range today.
So what we might do is just take a little bit of a break here, and I'll share the actual audio from the lav mic that I was wearing on the day that James was obviously filming that footage, and that footage and lav are interconnected. So where it was sitting was basically on my collarbone to hear, the pieces to camera that we deliver. But in this instance, because the stag walked into 7 meters and was roaring so intensely, the audio that it picked up was incredible. It picks up my hind calls, it picks up the stag roaring, the shot, all of this audio basically is captured. But hopefully what you can hear is the heartbeat. So we'll plug that in here, and hopefully you guys enjoy that. Yeah, pretty raw. You can hear the emotion probably in my heartbeat, and then obviously the sounds of that stag roaring right up close and personal. Pretty certain he's just gone down there. That was gnarly. Shot might have been a touch high, but I was just trying to clear these branches. I was at full draw for a long time. Not long, but I just didn't. He come in directly at us. I was hoping he was going to come in a bit quicker and go broadside, but no, he's the best stag we've seen by a long shot. I think he's like a 6'5" or something like that. Like, at least he's got a few points up top, but just quite heavy and real dark stained antlers. But it doesn't matter about the points or anything. It matters about what happened there. We just heard a roar below us. Gave out a couple of hind calls, got in position, and he took a long time coming in, but he was coming, and yeah, ended up shooting him here at maybe 10 meters or something. I'm not too sure, but we'll give him a bit. Finally, that wind held out. Yeah, that's just awesome. But I'm pretty sure I heard him crash just here in the Lantana. So I could see the arrow. The Fletcher's got really good peno front on, which is always a good thing. So
yeah, so as you can tell, like, there was a fair bit of emotion in Ayden's voice. Going back to the hunt a little bit, like when Ayden was saying it stopped just behind that ironbark, like he actually sort of looked up in our direction, similarly to what Ayden was saying about the like thinking that the wind was going to bust us. I actually thought he'd picked us out because we were so close. And anyway, it held, and he was able to get a perfect shot on this stag. But the other thing was, as you'll see and probably can hear in the footage, like that the stag's actually roaring so much because he's quite frustrated in like not being able to find these hinds. So he's almost saying like, "Where are you guys?" Because we hind called quite a lot while he was far away, and then except for the couple that Ayden gave to sort of shuffle his direction and steer him more into the path that he wanted him to be able to shoot him, we gave out like very few hind calls when he was coming in, and that's just to try and decrease the chance that he is able to like exactly pinpoint our location. Like they are obviously very good at being like, okay, the hind should be in this rough area. But yeah, he was very much just roaring, being like, "Where are you? Like, I know you're here. Like, frustrated as hell. Like, where are these hinds?" And that worked perfectly for us because it obviously gave Ayden time to settle his heart rate and sort of calm down before the shot, but also gave us plenty of time to set up and have that perfect opportunity where he came, waltzing into 7 or 8 meters and have the shot. But another little funny tidbit was we obviously very excited about getting like some awesome footage to share with you guys, but because we also wanted to share it with the guys back in camp, and we went back and we showed them, and one thing that you'll pick up from the audio that I left in there is Ayden actually gave a couple of hind calls straight after the shot. And as we've learnt from the stag that we've shot this year, but also from elk that I've shot previously, like these are very big animals that even with a very good shot can cover a lot of ground. And so trying to keep them calm after the shot is extremely important. So as you would have heard, Ayden gave out a couple of gave out a couple of hind calls, and we've seen from previous stags that died within sight, like you actually see their ears pin back and hear what you're doing, like they hear that there's hinds there. So with Ayden's one, it was pretty funny though, because we were sharing the footage with camp, and everyone was like, "Oh, that's sick," and blah blah blah. And then one of the guys sort of arced up and goes, "Oh, what did you do? Think you were going to be able to bring him back?" And we just sort of had a little bit of a laugh. And it's not that, yeah, like that. Our intention isn't that we're trying to bring, the stag back in to have another shot at him. It's mainly just trying to actually pull them up or get them to relax a little bit, so that hopefully they don't do this big, death run or whatever, and they actually like stop and start letting the how vital the shot is take effect, and hopefully they don't run as far after the shot.
So speaking after the shot, this brings us back to a podcast topic that I was pretty passionate about that we did. I believe it was episode 13 of the podcast. And to be honest, even as experienced hunters, we learn new things and get nervous all the time when it comes to, the moments after the shot. And for me, front on shots have always sort of been a little bit like that. And then having this stag come into 7 meters and the way it all transpired meant that, I actually had to sit there, and I said to James, like, I'm going to take my own advice from, that earlier podcast after the shot. And even though we'd watched the stag disappear down the ridge and sort of slow down briefly at around 40 meters after the shot, as James just said, I ripped a few of the hind calls to try and relax him, not for obviously bringing him back in, but just to try and let him know, because you've got to think that animal's just been hit by something pretty bloody hard. It's like getting punched in the face. If you're at a pub, here's an analogy. If you're at a pub and someone punches you in the face and then your girlfriend races over to you and goes, "Hey, it's all right, it's all right, it's all right, I'm here with you," it's probably going to be a lot more calming than if you get punched in the face and you wake up and you're looking on the floor and there's, you're not really sure what's going on. You see bright lights and all this type of stuff and you're staggering to the bathroom or something like that. So terrible analogy, but basically by ripping those hind calls, I was just trying to let him know that, hey, nothing's really happened. You were coming into some hind calls. We're still here. It's all good. Slow down. If it works, it works. If not, it shouldn't really alert him because it's a natural sound. So what I did find and take from it was that watching back the footage, it's actually amazing to see that the stag certainly does hear the calls. And like you can see that by his ears where they sort of flick back, and on those hind calls, even though he's dashing down the hill, he definitely recognizes that, they're being made. So what we did was make a mental note of where we last saw the stag, I guess, disappear. And that helped us to then obviously go and follow the trail sort of later on. So, being a front on shot, I was pretty happy with the penetration. I'd seen it go, 3/4, if not more, of the arrow disappear into his chest, which is normally a good indication of a front on shot. We also did have a little bit of room for caution. So we just sat down, waited about 20 minutes, had a snack, and then sort of, eventually resumed the blood trail. And after a good chat with James, both of us thought the shot was good on first impression. So we just went through those steps that we discussed, I guess, on the previous podcast. One thing that I did that I really have taken a lot of value in is from the shot, exactly where I took the shot, I marked it in to where I thought the stag was. I marked it in his hit, and then started a tracking feature and basically followed. We didn't have any blood for the first probably, I'd say 30 meters or so. All we were following were essentially just tracks, his running marks in the sort of damp soil, and then a plethora of like broken saplings and trees and things and bushes that he'd knocked down. And to be honest, I was getting a little bit nervous because, 30 meters when you're tracking it downhill seems far, but then by being able to like look back on my mapping software and hit where the shot was and go, oh, it's literally only been 30 meters when it felt like 100, was a good reminder of just keep going, keep doing the process, look for that next drop of blood. And sure enough, as soon as we found the first drop of blood, for the next 10, 15 meters, it was just, pretty solid blood. And it's almost like the arrow had taken effect and, maybe had been rattling around in there and finally had let out a bit of blood. But to be honest, I was actually glassing a lot down the bottom of the basin, looking for any bit of red, any bit of fur, any bit of antler, any bit of, blood, anything that, might give us a sign as to where he is. And to be honest, because of how steep the country was, we were basically looking over him. And, the whole process of taking it super slow and giving him 20 minutes and having snacks and stuff eventually actually turned out to be unnecessary, because that stag we ended up finding was 50 meters from the site of the hit. So he'd only gone 50 meters in a very, very steep downhill dash and died. And, cutting him up, it was evident that we'd obviously shot his heart and taken out the lungs and everything. And it was a super lethal shot. But that's why we, I guess, do that after the shot sequence, is because then you've got the peace of mind that, you've done it. And if things don't go well, we've got our phone, our tracking features, all these things that we've spoken about in that podcast to sort of look back on and try and do. But the best thing about it is if they are down in 50 meters, you simply delete those tracking features and whatnot, and you go on and take photos with your stag and retrieve the meat. And that's pretty much exactly what we did. We went down, found the stag, and then went into our usual sort of filming and photography sort of sequence, and then obviously took as much meat as we could, which was absolutely amazing to be able to then go back and share with everyone in camp.
Yeah, I think an important thing was we'd actually heard him do a little crash, but we both sort of like, given the front on shot, we were we just thought we'd give him some time. We reviewed the footage. We're both happy with the footage, especially the penetration. Like if you're getting a full shaft of penetration on a front on shot, like it's getting in there. It's just whether it's more like a central or whether you've gone off to one side and it's, it's only going to be getting one lung, for example, or something like that. But we'd both happily heard him crash. But just because you hear him crash, especially in that steep, really steep country, like from previous experience, like I know people that have shot stags really poorly and they've crashed and they've thought they're dead and they run up to them and the stag's not there. And it's just because it's tripped. And, especially because this stag like jumped and spun and, sprinted down the hill, like, we were fooling around, just walking around, with a backpack on, let alone you're trying to like sprint down a hill. And so it's nothing for them to take out saplings and lantana and bushes and stuff when they're trying to make their escape after the shot. And so just take that into account when you shoot something and you go to walk up to it and 2 seconds later and you think that it's down, because it might be actually 100 meters past that or 50 meters past that bedded and then, about to succumb to the shot. And then they look up and see you coming down the hill and they sprint off. So, I've never really regretted giving an animal more time. And for us, like we said, we've been hunting all morning, so it was easy. We just sat down, had a bit of a snack, had a drink, and a bit of camaraderie. Loved it, and had said how good was that. Looked at the footage, and then was able to follow him up. And yeah, he expired barely 50 meters down the hill, which was fantastic. But just taking that into account that a crash doesn't always mean that the animal is going to be right there. But yeah, in our sense, we'd gotten lucky, or not lucky, because it was all pretty textbook, to be honest, in terms of the shot sequence and everything like that. It was pretty well perfect. So, but yeah, Ayden was able to execute that shot perfectly, and he only made it 50 meters down the hill.
Hunt and Fool is the foremost hunting resource with varied levels of memberships to get you on your next adventure. Whether it be an annual trip or once-in-a-lifetime adventure, Hunt and Fool and the consultancy team will cater to your needs. James and I have been utilising their services for a couple of years now, and virtually immediately, James reaped the rewards when he drew a coveted limited entry elk tag. James would not have known about the opportunity, let alone ever applied for this unit, and therefore, without the assistance of our friends at Hunt and Fool, a hunt like this would not have been achievable. If you're interested in using Hunting Fool's license application services to draw more tags across the Western United States, then please email applications@huntandfool.com and mention Twin Elements to get 25% off your first year of service. The Hunt and Fool team will take care of it from there. I think now is as good as time as ever to get into the camaraderie and just atmosphere that we had in camp. So obviously returning back to camp with a stag and all that meat was something that we were striving to do. We'd watched everyone else for the previous, few days take deer. There were people taking their first deer, people taking their personal bests. And I think that just obviously goes back to the generosity and hospitality of the wonderful property owners who, extended the privilege of us being able to go and hunt on their place, which we certainly don't take for granted because we've got private property access of our own. Most of the hunting that we do is on private property, and we understand how hard it is to obviously obtain that access and then do the right thing constantly over and over time. But these property owners were just nothing short of incredible. The fact that they had, they hunt themselves and then we're inviting, multiple hunters. We'd never met them previously, and we were sort of an extension of the venture hunting crew. By being able to then go and obviously use their place, and they basically said, treat it as your own, just be respectful, and that was something that we obviously are super appreciative of. And then to be able to go back and celebrate with everyone was is really really cool. And I guess it's just sort of fun for us being able to return back to a camp and have a bit more atmosphere because, to be honest, a lot of the hunts that James and I do are in a swag or a tent or out of the car or whatever, and we're grinding for days on end, and it's just the two of us, and we sort of get on each other's nerves after a little bit of time, and it's shorter sleep, long days, super intense hunting. And then to have what I'd say is probably a little bit more of a relaxed hunt, even though we were hunting really hard, getting up early, getting back late, and all that type of stuff, hunting sun up till sundown and whatnot. We did have little lulls in the middle of the day where we'd go back and just share in stories and basically have story time with all these super like-minded people. It was great to hear about the history of the place and what their expectations were for it and what they want to do with the place and this and how they were catering it more and more to like hunting opportunities because that's what they do and that's what they're passionate about and that's what they're trying to bring people out that are similar like-minded to have these opportunities. It was just it was really really nice to be a part of, to be honest.
Yeah, it was definitely a different atmosphere that Ayden and I are used to, like what Ayden said. Like, not that, like, obviously with what we're doing with twin elements and stuff, like there is a sort of a business side of it in the sense that, we're trying to film hunts for you guys. And so you're really trying to push for efficiency in every way possible because as you guys, I'm sure most of you guys are avid hunters and outdoors men and women and getting out there all the time for yourselves. Like hunting in itself is quite difficult when you throw in the extra feature of trying to film that hunt and capture it in the best light possible to show hunting in the outdoors in the best light possible. Like it does become quite a complicated process. And so when you're putting that together, we really do try and, I guess, I don't know, it's almost like military format, to be honest. Like we're up early. Like if we're not filming stuff, we're trying to have breakfast and a coffee as soon as we can to get on the mountain to listen for stags, and then we hunt hard all day, and then you're trying to like film extra stuff at night to like sort of show the story, I guess. And Ayden will be heating up dinner, and I'll go and do a time lapse somewhere, and then I'll come back. We'll quickly eat dinner. Most of the time, we might talk about where we're going to hunt in the morning, and then we jump into bed. Like there's not really a lot of. I'm not going to say that's not fun because we love doing it. Like we wouldn't do it if we didn't, but it's not that sort of relaxed like vibes like what we had here where we're, I think sharing each other's stories was really cool and probably something we haven't done for a couple of years now, like where we've been in like a bigger hunting camp and you're like, oh, hey mate, how'd you go? And then probably for us, maybe reflect on their stalks and, if it didn't work out, like what could we have done differently and stuff like that. And same with, just discussing, like what Ayden was saying, like just discussing sort of the ethos that is hunting and like why we do it and, like things that we've seen and cool things that happen for the day and like, just life and stuff. Like it was a very different atmosphere. Like, I mean, even for Ayden and I, like we don't normally drink that much and stuff. And, we a couple of nights during the, that we were there, we'd go and have a couple of drinks with the owners and the venture crew and, just relax and just share hunting stories and from, all around the world from all of us and, like our different ideas or ideologies of hunting and, like just life. And it was really, really enjoyable just to have that sort of that camaraderie and just a really, really fantastic, just down to earth group of people all in one place, just having an absolutely fantastic time. And so it was something obviously Ayden and I are really appreciative of having the invitation. And it was just different from what we'd sort of typically done more recently, where it's sort of more not business, but just, I don't know, you just flat out all the time, like I even think of like that US hunt that we just did, like the Against All Odds film, where it was like, 20 days was just like grind. And then, you get to the point where you're almost just like grunting at each other to do things. And, like, it's like, do this, do that, do this, like we need to do that. Are you doing this? I'll do that. Like, it's just, whereas this was just a lot more relaxed, and it was fantastic. Like it was an amazing camp. Need a caffeine hit? We've got you covered. Power your passions with OzCaff Energy. Designed to be convenient, discreet and portable. These small caffeine pouches pack a punch and will get you out of those lows in no time. Place one of the pouches under your top lip for rapid absorption, which will have you performing your best in no time. With added benefits of 0 calories and 0 sugar, there's nothing to lose. Use code TWINELEMENTS for 10% off your next order.
Alrighty, well, we hope you have really enjoyed this Red Deer Camp Part 1 podcast. What we're going to do is get into our FAQ segment, which many of you as our listeners have been contributing to, which we're super grateful for. If you have any questions for the podcast, please send us an email with subject line FAQ to info@twinelements.com.au or DM either Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors or James Doumtsis Outdoors on our social media. We're probably most active on Instagram, so if you could please do that. We obviously always strive to answer them in person directly to you, and then obviously ask permission if we can use them on future podcast episodes just to help the greater community. This week, we're going to actually start with what is a bit of a correction or a bit of a contribution from one of our listeners, which we really appreciate, sent in by Damien, ADL Hills Livin on Instagram. And this is in relation to, if you've recently listened to us talk about the gutting versus gutless methods of butchering in episode 14, I believe we discussed it, which was part of like that Eating Wild Game podcast. You would have heard James talking about leaving the tenderloins in some of the smaller animals when we're doing the gutless method, just because it sort of can be a little bit messy and sometimes not necessarily worth it. But we've had Damien, as we said, message in, and Damien basically said that with a few precise cuts just below the last transverse vertebrae of the spine, you can pull aside and reflect the gastrointestinal tract and still get in there under the spine to extract the tenderloin. And that statement is absolutely spot on. We actually executed this with the red deer on this hunt. So because being a bigger animal and the red deer stag tenderloin is nearly the same size as like a small fallow doe's backstrap, for example, we utilize that technique. So it is definitely worth knowing this great little hack. And as Damien said, you can get in there and with a little bit of maneuvering and stuff, remove the whole tenderloin without having to gut the animal. It's just literally a couple of tiny little nicks. Sometimes you just pull the gastrointestinal tract aside and you can reach in under there. What I will add as well, if you are worried about getting a blade in there, just because the guts are often pressed right up along the spine and in that sort of area, back towards like, I guess, the pelvis, I guess. If you're worried about getting a blade in there with like minimal space, what you can do and what we often do is you can nearly scoop the tenderloin out most of the time sort of with your hands, just because they are generally that tender, and you can get pretty much the whole extraction of them by doing that method. So thank you very much, Damien, for that contribution. We did definitely know about this beforehand. We sort of, to be honest, denied about whether or not to mention it just because we didn't want to confuse people, but it might be worth us actually doing a video on it as well, just to sort of further explain what you've talked about there in terms of, cutting just below the vertebrae and being able to pull aside the gastrointestinal tract to get the tenderloin. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for sending that in, that correction. And definitely, like, I probably should have explained it. It was a reflection of probably my poor explanation. So yeah, definitely thank you for sending that correction in. And it's probably more just adding another 2 cents to it, probably more in smaller game species that, like sort of a fallow doe or a goat or something like that, or a small pig that I'm eating. It's probably more of an effort worth reward in terms of the size of the tenderloin that you actually get, in the sense that, like, if you shoot like a nanny goat, where often I'll take like the neck meat, the front legs, the back legs, and the back straps, like removing the eye fillets or the tenderloins, they're probably only 6 inches long and maybe like 2 or 3 fingers like wide, which is for the amount of effort required to go in there and then get them out. I just sort of don't find them worthwhile, but it's definitely worthwhile, us discussing at least the technique of so people can understand. Because like Ayden said, in our red stags, like where they're 10 inches long and probably a circumference of maybe 5 inches or so, then yeah, it's definitely worthwhile going in there and getting them. But on something like a nanny goat or even a fallow doe, like I just personally don't think it's probably worth the effort. But like we said, definitely worth describing the technique so that people have the option and availability to do that. So thank you very much for saying that, Damien, and keeping me accountable for what's discussed on this podcast.
So the next question has been sent in by a regular contributor to the podcast, none other than our good friend Luke Sandry. Luke sent us an image recently on Instagram and also had this caption with it. He just says, "Hey boys, why does certain parts of the meat turn this off color/texture? I always still eat it. It's definitely not spoiled. This was from a doe I shot 2 days ago. Gutless method, cooled in an esky as primal cuts about 30 minutes after finishing the butchering in the field, and then transferred to a fridge when I got home."
So meat can go at plenty of different colors. In this sense, it was a bit paler and lighter from the photo. What essentially has happened in that sense, I'd say, is a lot of the blood has actually left the meat, and which means it typically goes, that lighter pink color. We often see that with pork quite a lot, where it looks paler. But typically speaking, you probably see it where it goes actually darker, sort of that browny color and more purpley, and that's to do with the oxidation of the myoglobin in there. So myoglobin is obviously the main muscle fibers, I guess, responsible for making muscle and having movement in your body. And so that's what gives meat the red color. So when that essentially oxidizes, it can go that dark purpley brown color. So it can affect the eating quality a little bit if we're talking about like, higher end steaks and like all that type of thing. But in terms of if you're just like stewing it, mincing it and like that, like you're not going to see much of a difference. If you are really, really, really concerned about it, just through the appearance, you can trim it away. But as Luke has said, it definitely doesn't affect the from a food safety point of view, it doesn't affect it at all. And from an eating quality point of view, it has pretty minimal effects. So, I wouldn't be overly concerned about it. Like, especially if you've made sure you've taken the time to process it all properly. Any changes that you get in the sort of rigor mortis process and stuff like that, so any changes to the meat that you see after that are going to have pretty minimal effects, and I wouldn't be overly concerned about it. If you're new to butchering and hunting and stuff like that and see something like that, if you are really, really stressed about it and concerned, you can trim it, but most of the time it's going to be fine. So yeah, thanks Luke for sending that one in, the regular Q&As, and we appreciate the support on the podcast.
Alrighty, so as you guys are listening to this, we are actually returning from hunting roaring red stags and fallow deer. So as you've just heard, we've got plenty of critters on the deck and captured some beautiful content over this red raw period. We should start the process of editing, screenshotting the video, doing all of the content drop that you're used to over the coming weeks as we sort of have to get back into actual everyday work and life and sort of, get back into civilization. We've basically spent a month in the great outdoors doing what we love. So that's going to be a slight integration process, and then you should start seeing a lot more of this content over the next few weeks.
So hopefully you guys have all seen and entered our 20k YouTube subscriber giveaway. If you're late to the party or haven't entered yet, jump onto the YouTube, and what you need to do is go and find our Northern Territory highlight reel, which you then have to like and comment on that video, because that's where we're sort of running the giveaway from. And what you need to do with 25 words or less is comment where you would like to go on a hunt and what you'd like to hunt for. And you can go in the draw to win thousands of dollars worth of prizes, which our brands that we work with have kindly contributed to this big pool. So we're giving away a pair of lower boots. We've got an option 4 sight. We've got a dragonfly knife from Day 6 Gear. We've also got a dozen arrows. We've got some broadheads and apparel from Cayuga Broadheads. We've got some OzCaf pouches, plenty of supplements and electrolytes from Atlas Wild, and a massive, massive supply of coffee from Dog and Gun Coffee. So thank you to everyone that has supported the giveaway, and also thank you to everyone who has been generous enough to give these amazing prizes to the lucky winner, who's going to be drawn as soon as we get to 20,000 subscribers. So make sure to enter and be in the draw.
Next week's podcast episode continues with the Red Stag theme as we share more stories and encounters from Red Deer Camp Part 2, where we move slightly over in South East Queensland and join another couple of hunters in that camp. So we're really excited to obviously share those stories with you. So just make sure you're following along on the podcast. Please continue to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast. We're definitely growing at a rate that we're pretty proud of, and we more than ever appreciate the support we're getting on this, as it's quickly becoming sort of our most popular and favorite platform for getting our knowledge and just, the things that we get up to out to you guys as our listeners. So James and I are obviously very thankful and appreciative of all the support.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Hopefully you enjoyed that hunt recap. We certainly enjoyed being out there and getting plenty of footage and content for you guys, which should be dropping in the near future on our YouTube channel. But as always, thank you for supporting the channel, and we'll catch you next time on the Twin Elements podcast.